Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Seminar J of the Monique and Roland Vale People's Academy of International Law. My name is Marjorie Cohn, and I am the Dean of the People's Academy and a member of the Bureau of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. Today, we will discuss nuclear disarmament and the right to peace. Our distinguished faculty for this program includes Ivana Nikolic-Hughes, Olga Kuznetsova, Anna Illing, and Ryan Costello. Each of them will speak for 20 minutes, followed by a discussion between the faculty members, and then questions and answers with all of you. We have Spanish, French, and English translation. You can select your language at the bottom of your screen. Please put your questions in the Q&A box for our discussion. We will soon post on our website, peoplesacademy.net, the faculty presentations in English, Spanish, and French, along with links to relevant articles. You will receive an email when the program is posted. On April 7th, Donald Trump threatened to commit genocide against Iran when he declared, "A whole civilization will die tonight." The president of the only country ever to have used nuclear weapons threatened to annihilate a country without them. This seminar will address the most important and urgent international law issue of our time: the right of peoples to peace and the need for negotiations between the nuclear powers toward arms control leading to nuclear disarmament. The survival of life on the planet depends on it. We would like to dedicate this seminar to Peter and Cora Weiss, lifelong advocates for peace and a world free of nuclear weapons, who both passed away at the end of last year. Peter, a visionary international human rights lawyer, founded the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, and as co-president of the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms, he played a key role in the International Court of Justice's historic 1996 advisory opinion, Legality of the Threat or Use of Nuclear Weapons. Cora was active in Women's Strike for Peace, and she co-chaired the new mobilization committee to end the war in Vietnam, helping to organize massive anti-war and anti-nuclear demonstrations over the decades. Peter and Cora are an inspiration to the People's Academy of International Law. Peace is not simply the absence of war. Peace requires that all states refrain from interfering in the internal affairs of other states, settle their disputes through negotiations, and create conditions necessary to eliminate the causes of international conflict and avoid nuclear war. The right to peace is inherent in the very fabric of the UN Charter. Through the Charter and subsequent UN resolutions, the human right to peace is ripening into a norm of international law. In 1991, the UN Security Council reiterated in Resolution 687 the objective of the establishment of a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region of the Middle East. As the US and Israel, two nuclear-armed states, prosecute their war of aggression against Iran, a non-nuclear-armed state, the issue of nuclear disarmament is even more imperative. The war in Iran has made nuclear proliferation more likely, not less, according to Foreign Policy in Focus. Clearly, if Iran had nuclear weapons, it would not have been attacked. That's a powerful object lesson for other countries in why they might want to pursue nuclear weapons themselves. Meanwhile, France is undertaking the first quantitative increase in its nuclear arsenal since 1992. In the words of French President Emmanuel Macron, the next 50 years will be an era of nuclear weapons. The collapse of the US-Russia nuclear disarmament system and the unlawful military threats from nuclear-armed states toward non-nuclear states, particularly the US aggression against Iran during nuclear negotiations, are weakening the credibility and normative strength of the non-proliferation regime and expanding military confrontation while intensifying the global nuclear crisis. Today, our faculty will analyze the urgent need for and obstacles to effective global arms control, and they will discuss what lawyers and human rights activists can do to achieve that goal. Our first faculty member is Dr. Ivana Nikolic-Hughes. She is president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation and a senior lecturer in the discipline of chemistry at Columbia University. She holds a BS with honors from California Institute of Technology, where she studied chemical engineering and completed her senior thesis with Professor Frances Arnold, the first U.S. woman to win a Nobel Prize in chemistry. Dr. Hughes obtained her PhD from Stanford University, where she was an American Heart Association pre-doctoral fellow. She has been a faculty member at Columbia University since 2008 and was awarded the Lenfest Distinguished Columbia Faculty Award for 2020. Her work on ascertaining the radiological conditions in the Marshall Islands has been covered widely. Dr. Hughes currently serves as a member of the Scientific Advisory Group to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a committee consisting of 15 experts from around the world who advise the states parties on scientific issues as they pertain to the treaty. Her writing has appeared in Al Jazeera in Arabic, The Nation, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, The Hill, Scientific American, The Diplomat, Common Dreams, Truth Out, Transcend Media Service, and elsewhere. She has spoken widely on nuclear disarmament, including at the Vatican, in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Wilton Park, at the United Nations in Geneva, New York, and Vienna, and elsewhere. She has also frequently appeared on podcasts and in webinars, including on the Tucker Carlson Network, Neutrality Studies, Camp Ganyan, Useful Idiots, and elsewhere. Dr. Hughes will address the role of international and bilateral treaties in nuclear disarmament. Dr. Hughes, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ms. Khan, for this wonderful introduction. I'm going to begin by sharing my slides. Share here, and I hope you can all see my slides. So thank you very, very much for the very overly kind introduction and for the opportunity to be a part of this wonderful program, today's wonderful program, and of course the entire series. It's truly an honor, and I'm so deeply touched that you began your remarks by recognizing the role that Cora and Peter Weiss had played over many decades on this the very issue that we're here to discuss. I also really found your opening remarks quite comprehensive in terms of situating us in the moment that we find ourselves in now, more than 80 years past the entry into the nuclear age. The entire time was not simple, but I think it's fair to say that we find ourselves in a truly unique moment of the nuclear age, where not only do we have multiple conflicts involving directly and indirectly nuclear weapon states, nuclear armed states, but we also have the kind of rhetoric that really had not been used until even just the last few weeks. The rhetoric that you referred to coming from President Donald Trump, threatening to bomb Iran into the Stone Age, threatening that a whole civilization will die. It's really quite incomprehensible. So I think just one way that we can sort of think about where we are in the nuclear age is to consider the 2026 Doomsday Clock announcement from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. This actually occurred on January 27th. So this is about a month before the onset of the Iran war. And I think I can safely say that the hands of the clock would have probably been even closer to midnight had the announcement occurred after what we've seen over the last several weeks. And yet the clock was set to 85 seconds to midnight, the closest it had ever been to this hypothesized nuclear Armageddon, hypothesized end of human civilization as we know it. The clock really began as it kind of serendipitously in 1947. Its hands have moved in response to current political, geopolitical events closer and further away from midnight. I actually came to this country, to the United States, in 1994 as a foreign exchange student and have been here ever since, living here ever since. And in the year in which I arrived, the hands clocks were at 17 minutes to midnight. So that can give you a sense, a little more than 30 years later, we're far, far closer to this. And yet, this is really not a new idea. The idea that we are threatened by nuclear weapons in a way that is unlike anything that humanity had seen up to this point is, in fact, very old. Albert Einstein, just in the year following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as the very first nuclear explosion in New Mexico, had stated that the unleashed power of the atom has changed everything except for our modes of thinking, and we thus drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. In fact, President John F. Kennedy, speaking at the United Nations General Assembly, stated that we must abolish nuclear weapons before they abolish us. And we also have later in the 80s, at the time that Cora and Peter played such an instrumental role in really rallying the general public on this issue, Reagan and Gorbachev admitted that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And now we're 40 years plus since that statement. And the notion that nuclear weapons could be used or the nuclear war could be won is unfathomably back with us. So what I want to give today is, as Ms. Khan so kindly described, I actually come to this issue, I come to this topic in with a deep sense of concern, but also deep sense of responsibility as someone who is a scientist. So I don't come to it as a historian or as a lawyer or as a policymaker or a diplomat. But I do see the importance of the international architecture. It's very easy to at times think about some of these treaties and kind of lament the fact that they haven't gotten us to where we need to be. My response is frequently to say that probably if it weren't for these treaties, we might not even be here at all. And so I think it's important to have a little bit of a sense for where we are in terms of this nuclear disarmament architecture. Here, I focus entirely on the United Nations treaties, and I drew the pyramid. Again, I'm not a scientist. I am a scientist, not an artist. So the pyramid is entirely of my own design. But the idea being here that I actually listed the four main treaties that exist within the framework of the United Nations in chronological order from the one at the bottom being the oldest to the one at the top, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Because it was at the top, I didn't get to write out the full name, but you'll see the full name in just a moment. And I move up chronologically, but I also do really believe that these treaties actually build on one another. And that in some sense, even just the idea that we can get together and, as I'll describe in just a second, the Partial Test Ban Treaty was passed in 1963, mere months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And to me, this is a huge source of inspiration that we can, in fact, be in a moment of crisis and then have a fundamental breakthrough on this issue. Because, in some sense, if not that I would ever advocate for, keeping nuclear weapons if everyone's behaving, of course not. But it's almost more urgent and more important, arguably, to make progress at these times when we see that nuclear weapons use can be all too real, and that the risk is not just real, but unacceptably high. So let me begin by just saying a few words about each of these treaties. So again, you have a little bit of a sense for where we are and where we still need to go. So the Partial Test Ban Treaty was negotiated and it entered into force in 1963. The initial negotiations were between the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, the United States. This was really a diplomatic achievement, unlike anything up to that point, between President John F. Kennedy, the US president, and his counterpart in the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. And again, this occurred mere months after what I would argue was, for the Cold War, the most not just difficult and challenging, but the most risky moment of the Cold War. I'll just add that many experts consider the moment we find ourselves in today to be even more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis itself. Following this initial agreement between the three countries, other countries joined. This was basically opened to United Nations member states. 94 states ended up ratifying this treaty. 23 just acceded to it. That's kind of just a legal separate term, but they all became states parties to this treaty, agreeing not to test nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, underwater, and in outer tests. And in outer space, significantly, of course, this didn't end underground testing, but at least it got us to a point where we stopped testing not just in the atmosphere with, enormous amounts of fallout, both locally and around the world. But also, it ended up pulling us away from testing some of the absolute most powerful weapons that had been kind of the hallmark of the testing programs, in particular of the United States and the Soviet Union up until that point. Down here, I also added that China, France, and North Korea never actually joined this treaty. And I think it's significant to just think about whether things can be achieved, even if not everyone is at the table at that moment. And as I'll explain in just another moment, we do have a kind of successor treaty to this, which is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So after the success of the Partial Test Ban Treaty, and this was really actually another treaty that was a kind of brainchild of President John F. Kennedy, even though he had, of course, passed away in the same year that the Partial Test Ban Treaty was, or he was assassinated in the same year that the Partial Test Ban Treaty had been negotiated and entered into force. But President John F. Kennedy was very concerned about proliferation of nuclear weapons. He thought that if we had continued on that current path, that in a decade or so, there would be 15 or 20 or 25 nuclear armed states. And he just recognized immediately that this would, lead us into a state of nuclear war and annihilation of human civilization and possibly all of life on the planet faster than we could even think. And so this idea of preventing proliferation became the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is marked by what we refer to as three pillars. The first, on non-proliferation, states that commit not to acquire nuclear weapons. On peaceful use, states that have nuclear technologies, passing those on to other states for peaceful purposes. And then a very important, but very much ignored element of this treaty is nuclear disarmament. There is an article in the treaty called Article 6, which implores the states to negotiate in good faith towards not just nuclear disarmament, but total and complete disarmament, towards abolishing war, in essence. So this treaty was negotiated in 1968, entered into force in 1970. This coming Monday begins here in New York City the 11th review conference of the treaty. It's going to be a very, very contentious one. On the one hand, this is one of the most successful treaties, in fact, not just on nuclear disarmament, but as a whole at the United Nations. The number of parties is huge, 188 states parties and 2 observers. And again, it's worth noting that China and France didn't join until more than 20 years after the treaty was negotiated and even entered into force. And we do have 4 other states that are nuclear armed possessors that are not parties to the treaty. That's, of course, India, Israel, Pakistan, North Korea. North Korea had been a part of the treaty, but it left it in 2003, learning exactly the lesson that Ms. Khan highlighted in what it means for nuclear armed states to attack non-nuclear armed states, and what that means for the viability of a regime. So North Korea took that lesson very seriously and tested its first weapons in 2006. The third treaty I want to say just again a few words about is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Again, a kind of successor treaty to the Partial Test Ban Treaty, as well as a complement to the NPT. This is about banning all nuclear explosions, whether for military or civilian purposes, as well as obviously underground. And this treaty actually opened for signatures in 1996, but has not yet entered into force. It does have a large organization behind it, which does all sorts of verification work on ensuring that nuclear weapons are not being tested. It's also the organization that detected the tests by North Korea. And the number of ratifications is enormous, and yet it hasn't entered into force because certain countries that need to ratify the treaty haven't done so, and the lack of those ratifications entered into force. Russia had ratified the treaty in the 90s and withdrew their ratification in 2023 as a response to the fact that the US had never ratified the treaty, and Russia claimed to want parity with the United States on nuclear matters. China, Egypt, Iran, Israel, and US have all signed this treaty but not ratified it. Again, ratification, a head of state, for example, or a foreign minister, someone authorized by the government can sign the treaty. Ratification typically involves a legislative body. So, for example, in the United States, that would be to vote with 2/3 of the Senate being required for a treaty, for an international treaty, to in fact oblige a state by all its provisions. And what's really important to know about all these treaties is once a state becomes a state party to a treaty, though the treaty's provisions become national law, they're not just something that we sort of, look over and say, oh, should we follow this or not? It is part of our national laws. So North Korea and Pakistan also had never signed this treaty. So before I tell you about the very last treaty, that the most recent one, and in many, many ways, the most ambitious one, which is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, I just want to highlight a couple of facts so that we're all on the same page about what it is that we're really discussing when we talk about nuclear weapons. And so here I'm sharing, this is a graph of estimated nuclear warhead arsenals of the actually now more than 9 states are represented here, partly because South Africa at one point possessed nuclear weapons and then gave them up. But the other 9 that currently have nuclear weapons are all here. The gray line that you see here is the total number of nuclear weapons in the world. And then we have the blue line from the United States, which of course was the first one to possess them. And then we have Soviet Union, now Russia, in this red line. And then everybody else, and this begins to give you a sense for the size of these arsenals. Everybody else is basically down here at the bottom. So it was always the United States and now Russia that have had the by far the largest arsenals. At the moment, they have more than 85% combined, more than 85% of the world's arsenals. One of the reasons I like showing this graph is that it demonstrates that we've in fact made progress. We just need to make further progress, and that is that in 1986, the total number of nuclear warheads was at about 70,000. We are now at over 12,000. And again, we just need to make further progress. This is a political problem. It's not a problem of knowing how to get rid of nuclear weapons. And I think that really stands in contrast with something like climate change, where the solutions are there's a very complex set of solutions that need to be and decisions that need to be implemented. The other thing I want to show just before I speak briefly about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is we often think of nuclear weapons as something that had only been used in the atomic bombings by the United States on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yes, that it would be true to say the nuclear weapons have only been used in a state of war in those two instances. However, we have in fact exploded nuclear weapons. We typically use the term tested nuclear weapons, but there was really nothing experimental. These were full-blown nuclear explosions in pretty much all around the world. There were more than 2,000 of them. The United States conducted more than 1,000 more nuclear explosions than all other states combined. Here you see on this map, all of the blue circles refer to United States nuclear tests. The red ones were by the Soviet Union. We have in pink is the British test. There were some in Australia, here in the Republic of Kiribati, as well as even in the continental United States. France also tested in Algeria and in French Polynesia. All of the tests that you see where the circles are filled in, the size of the circles corresponds to the energy yield of the explosion, but the filled in circles correspond to atmospheric or underwater tests. It's only in places like Alaska, where the US only tested underground. And then you'll see that, for example, India and Pakistan also only tested underground. All right, so let me now just tell you just a little bit about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Again, this is the newest kid on the block of attempting to not just curtail, but eliminate this existential threat to humanity posed by nuclear weapons. Currently, there are 74 states parties. You see them shown in green in this map. And you see that the signatory states, of which there are 25, are in yellow. And you can pretty much tell that this is mostly a Global South treaty with some notable exceptions. For example, Ireland, Austria, Malta, and the Holy See in Europe. But for the most part, this is Kazakhstan. We really are looking at a largely a Global South treaty. It's really a treaty where the states that do not possess nuclear weapons are saying that nuclear weapons possession and the risk of nuclear war puts them in danger, and not just the states that may use those weapons. And this is very well supported by science, in the sense that nuclear war anywhere in the world today would have such global environmental impacts, including things like nuclear winter, ozone layer destruction, spread of radiation, that again, we do not exaggerate when we say that this is an existential threat to all of humanity and quite possibly to all of life on the planet. So this is what these states are saying. You are endangering us, and we should have a say in what happens with these nuclear weapons. So this treaty entered into force in 2021. At this time, it has more than half of all UN member states as either states parties or signatory states. And I've noted here in red are all the nuclear arm possessors. We just saw the list on the previous slide. And in orange are states that are hosting nuclear weapons, primarily the 5 in Europe that host US nuclear weapons. That's Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, Italy, and Turkey, and then Belarus, where Russia has also, Belarus, which is also hosting some Russian nuclear weapons as of very recently. This treaty actually bans any and all nuclear weapon activities, including not just developing, using, but including threats to use nuclear weapons. And very importantly, from the very last slide that I showed you, the treaty has humanitarian provisions for victim assistance in environmental remediation. As I showed, there have been over 2,000. So, of course, we know about the tremendous suffering of the survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But this is, of course, not the only suffering of the nuclear age. There have been many communities in the places that I showed on the map that were impacted by nuclear weapons testing, as well as communities impacted by nuclear weapons development. And so this treaty, in fact, has humanitarian provisions for victim assistance and environmental remediation under precisely those conditions. And I want to just say one last thing, and then I'm going to end. Just back to this graph and demonstration of just the difference in really an order of magnitude difference when it comes to the size of the arsenals of the different nuclear armed states. For it is the US and Russia that have the world's largest arsenals. And in my mind, that is where this process must begin. We must continue to build international agreements where we recognize what is at stake in a world awash with not just conflict, but awash with nuclear weapons. And at the same time, we must also recognize that the first step in this process has got to be a severe reduction in the arsenals of the United States and Russia. Of course, in early February, the New START agreement between the two nuclear superpowers expired, the last standing agreement between them. The Russian president, President Putin, had proposed a 1-year extension of the treaty, a proposal that the Trump administration seemingly just ignored. I think this is of paramount importance. And so, in addition to thinking about what we can do to bring the world together on these issues, I think it's also really critical that we think about what can be done to bring the US and Russia back to a negotiating table where they consider not just to extend previous or kind of restart previous agreements, but be even more ambitious and proceed towards not just further disarmament, but even elimination of nuclear weapons. And here I'll just add that this is quite literally something that Presidents Reagan and Gorbachev almost agreed to in Reykjavik in 1986. The sticking point ended up being Reagan's Star Wars program of missile defense. I think if they could have gone that close, we can, in our lifetimes, achieve this goal. And so on that note, I will stop sharing. And I look forward to the presentations of the other panelists and to our discussion and your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hughes, for explaining the history and substance of the architecture of international nuclear disarmament treaties, and for explaining that this is a political problem and an existential threat to us all. Our next faculty member is Ms. Olga Kuznetsova. She is the head of division at the Department for Non-Proliferation and Arms Control at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, or MFA. Ms. Kuznetsova graduated from the Moscow State University of International Relations. She holds bachelor's and master's degrees in international relations. Since joining MFA, Ms. Kuznetsova has been involved in NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, related issues, including during her postings to Austria, the Russian mission to the international organizations in Vienna, and Switzerland, the Russian mission to the United Nations and other organizations in Geneva. Ms. Kuznetsova will discuss the Russian position on nuclear disarmament. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I will try to give a national perspective on nuclear disarmament, the perspective of a nuclear weapon state. But first of all, I would like to say that I would subscribe to the most of the points that were made by Ms. Kohn at the beginning of the seminar. Especially concerning the attempts of some states to abuse the non-proliferation aspects at the pretext of defending actually the NPT goals, that is non-proliferation itself. So as for Russian perspective, we remain committed to the idea of ridding humanity of nuclear threat through a formula that envisages the achievement of a world free of nuclear weapons and safer for all as the ultimate goal of nuclear disarmament efforts. This commitment is based exclusively on a comprehensive approach to Article 6 of the NPT. According to this approach, such efforts should be considered an integral part of the holistic process of general and complete disarmament. Russia continues to believe in the immutable principle that disarmament measures, including nuclear disarmament, and related initiatives cannot be separated from the overall military, political, and strategic context. It must be implemented on a consensual basis, in a step-by-step manner, and in a way that promotes international peace, stability, and undiminished and increased security for all. Our country is deeply convinced that the interconnection between the international security situation and the prospects for new disarmament measures is indisputable and of fundamental importance for assessing the feasibility of particular disarmament ideas and proposals, given the realities of the historical moment and its specific security conditions. To our assessment, in current circumstances, the international security and strategic stability environment is being adversely affected by several closely interrelated factors that directly impact the national security of the Russian Federation. And I would name these factors. The relentless expansion of the NATO military bloc towards the borders of the Russian Federation against the principle of equal and indivisible security, accompanied by a hostile policy adopted by the majority of the alliance's member states to infringe upon the core interests of our country and undermine its national security. Bringing NATO military strategic infrastructure closer to the borders of the Russian Federation, coupled with a destabilizing buildup of significant combat forces and intensification of military activities, including those of a provocative nature, in areas adjacent to the Russian Federation. Attempts by NATO member states to inflict a so-called strategic defeat on the Russian Federation, fraught with the risk of direct armed conflict, including head-on military collision between nuclear powers. An accelerated militarization pursued by the European NATO member states under the stated purpose of preparing for an so-called upcoming large-scale war with the Russian Federation. The pursuit by the United States, with the support of its allies, of overwhelming military supremacy over any adversary, to the detriment of the strategic equilibrium and balance of forces. The pursuit by NATO member states to consolidate unilaterally advantageous imbalances in non-nuclear military capabilities and enhance their collective superiority across all operational domains. The intensive and extensive development within the North Atlantic Bloc, which proclaimed itself a nuclear alliance of nuclear sharing arrangements and assets involving broad participation of non-nuclear member states, and relying on US nuclear weapons forward deployed at an increasing number of sites in Europe. And from that sites, they can be expeditiously delivered to critical targets on the territory of the Russian Federation. The integration of NATO's nuclear sharing elements into the extended deterrence schemes practiced by the US in the Asia-Pacific region, with a trend towards an establishment of a trilateral nuclear alliance of the United States, the Republic of Korea, and Japan. A radically deepened coordination among European nuclear weapon states on military nuclear policies, including the planning of nuclear weapons employment and joint conduct of such operations, against the backdrop of deliberations promoted under anti-Russian rhetoric on creating an independent pan-European nuclear capability to supplement the US nuclear umbrella. Provocative statements in the capitals of US allied non-nuclear weapon states about possible far-reaching changes in their policies regarding nuclear weapons. Up to the point of potentially acquiring such weapons. The emergence and expansion of arrangements for the transfer of highly enriched nuclear material from Western nuclear weapon states to their allies for military purposes, for example, as fuel for nuclear-powered submarines. Statements by the US leadership on the possible resumption of nuclear testing. The deployment by certain Western states of low-yield nuclear warheads on strategic class ballistic missiles for the purposes of limited nuclear use in Europe and the Asia-Pacific region. The development of a global and multi-domain US missile defense system with a space-based strike component, and the doctrinal enshrinement of the deeply destabilizing left-of-launch concept, which envisages preemptive or preventive strikes. The deliberate dismantling by the United States of the Arms Control Agreement framework, initiated by the US withdrawal from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2002. These negative factors objectively and significantly complicate the international security and strategic stability landscape. They hinder efforts to forge constructive and fruitful interaction in order to agree on risk reduction and arms control measures, and create serious obstacles to progress along the path of disarmament, including further reductions of nuclear arsenals. From the Russian perspective, all these issues, and I can name other issues as well, but for the sake of time, I will not go deep into this. These issues require international community's most serious attention in the context of shaping the favorable prerequisites for disarmament efforts. Without doubt, intensive collective efforts to address the challenges outlined above are in high demand. Such efforts should be based on the principles of equal and indivisible security, as well as of undiminished and increased security for all. To get a full picture of the vision across all three NPT pillars, I would recommend you to read the national report of the Russian Federation, which was submitted to the 2026 NPT Review Conference. And this report is posted on the NPT website. And let me react to some of the points made by Ms. Hughes. First of all, concerning the START treaty. Ms. Hughes rightly pointed out to the initiative by the Russian president concerning the START treaty, but I would like to clarify that the initiative is not about an extension of the START treaty. It's about well, the initiative invited parties to the START treaty assume voluntary self-limitations with regard to compliance with the treaty's central limits for at least 1 year following its expiry on February 5th, 2026. So it's not about extension. It's about voluntary compliance with the limits under the treaty. And Ms. Hughes rightly highlighted the so-called Reagan-Gorbachev formula about the nuclear war. And I would like to remind you that this very formula was confirmed by all the 5 nuclear weapon states in the joint statement of the leaders of the 5 nuclear weapon states on preventing nuclear war and avoiding arms races of January 3rd, 2022. And its central element is the tenet that a nuclear war must never be fought, and accordingly, that any military confrontation among nuclear powers must be avoided. And equally significant is the statement's emphasis on preventing an arms race that would benefit none and endanger all, which directly echoes the provisions of the NPT. In our understanding, there is no viable alternative to the formula set forth in this document, namely that the tasks in question should be pursued on the basis of mutual respect and acknowledgement of one another's security interests and concerns. But regrettably, nowadays, the current situation in the dialogue among the 5 nuclear weapon states, some of which have explicitly abandoned understandings and principles set forth in this joint statement, which I mentioned. So we do not see any political foundation for a fruitful and results-oriented dialogue among 5 nuclear weapon states. So I think I will end at this stage, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kuznetsova, for detailing the steps that the US and NATO are taking that lead to global imbalance and increase the danger of nuclear war. And also, thank you for explaining that the Russian Federation proposed a 1-year voluntary compliance with the START treaty. Thank you again. Our next faculty member is Anna Illing. She is an Italian journalism master's student who has analyzed local politics for Voci di Cortina, national and international politics for La Svolta and Generazione magazine. And she has published analyses of Middle Eastern geopolitical relations for the Geopolitics Network Group. She recently wrote an article in Mondoweiss titled A Brief History of the Israeli Nuclear Program, the Open Secret at the Heart of the Iran War. Ms. Illing will address Israel and nuclear weapons, the mysterious and hidden history. Ms. Illing?
Hi, thanks for inviting me and having me here. I am sorry for my voice. I'm a bit sick, but let's do this anyway. So yes, Israel's nuclear program. I'll try to touch on what we know about it and why it matters for peace and stability in the region. And indeed, it is mysterious and hidden history. Basically, the way it all went down, it was between secrecy, public tacit knowledge, and support, both materially and diplomatically, from the West, allowing Israel to play a game of strategic ambiguity, which is still in place today. And I'll try to detail some aspects of this topic. So we are in 1950, and Ben Gurion launches Israel's nuclear program. Ben Gurion is Israel's first prime minister. It all starts with this place right here in the picture. It is the Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center, commonly known as Dimona. Dimona is a town nearby. I guess easier to remember. Already here, it's interesting to note the location of the center. It's in the Negev Desert, 152 kilometers from Tel Aviv and 90 kilometers from Jerusalem. If you don't do kilometers, just know it's a bit. 70 years later, so today this facility is considered the most important pillar of Israel's nuclear program. It was built with French help. At the time, the French government was trying to build an alliance against the Egypt Prime Minister Nasser, and it kind of saw this opportunity to strengthen this alliance against Nasser. Now, except for the French government, everyone was kind of left in the dark. So it's kind of difficult to understand how it developed. It is believed, but yes, it's important to say believed, and because we cannot state any certainty, that Israel had built an underground separation plant by 1965, that it had produced weapon-grade plutonium in 1966, and that it could assemble a nuclear weapon before the 1967 Six-Day Wars. Moreover, there was this particular incident, the Bela incident of 1979, which is presumably the only nuclear test Israel has ever done. It was a joint nuclear test with apartheid area South Africa. But here there was a US investigation on the matter, but so it is, we do know that it was one of the two of them or both, but that again is still just beliefs. And in fact, what the world could know was simply what Ben Gurion reported to the Israeli Knesset in 1960. He said that the Dimona reactor I just showed was a research reactor which would serve industry, agriculture, health, and science. There comes a moment when beliefs become facts. That happens in 1986. So this guy in the picture, Mordechai Vanunu, was a former Israel nuclear technician and had been an employee at Dimona for 8 years. He decided to come forward and share with the Sunday Times details and photographs of the Dimona nuclear research centers, which clearly showed that we were not talking about a research reactor which would serve industry, agriculture, health, and science, as Ben Gurion had described it. In fact, on the contrary, we we're finding out that Israel was ranked as the world's sixth nuclear power and possessed as many as 200 atomic warheads. For his acts of whistleblowing, he was imprisoned for 18 years, 11 of which he spent in solitary confinement. He was released 20 years ago, but he's still banned from traveling or speaking to foreign journalists. Now, this was the first time we kind of had evidence of what was actually happening in Israel, but not everybody was caught by surprise. So on one side, we have Richard Nixon. He, in 1969, so a while before the time that these details were released to the Sunday Times, made a deal called a nuclear understanding with Golda Meir, who was the Israeli prime minister. This deal basically implied that the US would not ask questions if Israel would maintain silence and vagueness around its capabilities and avoided testing its nuclear weapons. So from this moment, it basically took another 20 years for the world to know, thanks to the act of whistleblowing, and another 20 years for the documents that were detailing this nuclear understanding to be declassified. That happened in 2006. And still, when asked whether any countries in the Middle East possessed nuclear weapons, Barack Obama who said he would not speculate. This happened in 2008 when he was serving his first term in office. On the other side, we have the UK. In 2005, the BBC found out and revealed that 15 years before, so we're talking late 50s, beginning of the 60s, so when Israel was beginning its nuclear program, in that time, Britain had secretly supplied 20 tons of heavy water. Heavy water is water that goes through a laborious electrolysis process, which results in the water containing extra nutrients. If we see the nuclear reactor that Israel had at the time, so at the very beginning, this water was fundamental for this reactor. Now, there was actually a resolution that came to the UN Assembly that started by Egypt that would basically impose to Israel to be more transparent about what it was doing with nuclear weapons. This happened in December 2014, and the resolution was passed 151 to 5 or 6. I don't remember the exact number, but 5 or 6. But UN resolutions are not binding, so nothing really changed. And what was the idea of this resolution? Well, it came about because Israel is the only Middle Eastern countries and one of the 3 countries in the world that have never signed the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons we just talked about, together with India and Pakistan. North Korea also withdrew from it, but it did sign it at least. Moreover, of the world's 9 nuclear powers, US, Russia, China, Pakistan, India, North Korea, and Israel. Israel is the only one that does not officially admit having nuclear weapons. And in fact, to this day, we have estimates of what is happening. So we can talk about 90 nuclear warheads. We can talk about potentially enough plutonium for 187 to 277 nuclear weapons and ballistic missile that could reach 4,800 to 6,500 kilometers. Again, if you don't do kilometers, that's quite a lot. And in fact, if we put this in a global perspective, this numbers I just talked about, Israel would be the second smallest nuclear power in the world, just above Korea. I guess the point is these are estimates. So how accurate they are, we don't really know. And that's kind of the point on one side, at least for Israel, in the sense that this was kept into place thanks to clear rhetoric that was basically one of neither confirming nor denying. So you may know that I have it, but I will not confirm it, no, give you numbers. So basically, I'll be a bigger threat because you don't know what you're facing, and that's exactly the strategic ambiguity I talked about at the beginning. Now, curiously enough, Israel, since the 60s, Israel has pledged not to be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons in the Middle East. It's a very common sentence that many Israeli officials have mentioned, including Benjamin Netanyahu in 2011. And then we also talk about this sanction option. Basically, this means that Israel would resort to nuclear retaliation in defense from an existential threat. So again, you know that I have weapons for a nuclear retaliation, but I will not tell you more. I'll leave it at that. Now, there have been in history occasions where, in fact, this so-called sanction options could have been used, let's say. So, the 1973 war, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel, well, according to historians, that was a moment where Israel actually considered the nuclear option. Then in 2016, Netanyahu said, and I'll read the quote here. Our submarine fleet acts as a deterrent to our enemies. They need to know that Israel can attack with great might anyone who tries to harm it. And I think there's no better example of the Samson option and of the strategic ambiguity I just talked about. And then more recently, in November 2023, so after the 7th October attack, Israeli Heritage Minister said in a radio interview that dropping a nuclear bomb on the Gaza Strip was an option. Now, there are consequences to this strategic ambiguity that seems to be working out very well for Israel. So, first of all, it begs the question, how much can we trust it? And in fact, the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation reads on its website, the lack of clarity surrounding an Israeli nuclear weapons program is a key obstacle to establishing a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. So from not being the first country to introduce the nuclear weapon in the Middle East and this great pledge not to be the first one, Israel becomes the key obstacle. Which one is it? That would be my question. Then, more recently, and with a more tangible consequences, on its first statement after the 28th of February attack on Iran, Donald Trump said, in regards to Iran, just imagine how emboldened this regime would be if they ever had and actually were armed with nuclear weapons as a means to deliver their message. Well, to me, we don't need a lot of imagination. Israel is kind of a case in point, and if we really want to create this weapons of massive destruction free zone in the Middle East, now with this specific geographical focus, I think we do need to talk about all actors included and all the nuclear powers, Israel included, and not just focus on Iran. That being said, I conclude my presentation here, and I think that's a good way to go to the next panelist.
Thank you, Ms. Illing, for explaining the hidden truth about Israel's nuclear arsenal. As the U.S. and Israel portray Iran, which does not have nuclear weapons, as a threat, lost in the discourse is the fact that Israel is armed with nuclear weapons and that an Israeli official very, very alarmingly said that dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza was an option. Very, very frightening. Our final faculty member is Ryan Costello. He joined the National Iranian American Council, or NIAC, in April of 2013 as a policy fellow, and he currently serves as policy director. In this role, Mr. Costello directs NIAC's policy team in its work to influence policymakers, monitor legislation, conduct research and writing, and coordinate advocacy efforts. Prior to joining NIAC, Mr. Costello served as a program associate at the Connect US Fund, where he focused on nuclear non-proliferation policy. In that role, he coordinated the Fissile Materials Working Group, a coalition of 70 domestic and international organizations dedicated to preventing nuclear terrorism. He graduated from American University's School of International Service with a Master of Arts in U.S. Foreign Policy, and from Ursinus College, where he majored in History and International Relations. Mr. Costello's work has been published in The National Interest, Defense One, Huffington Post, The Hill, Roll Call, Globalog, and many other outlets. Mr. Costello will discuss Iran, from a model of multilateral diplomacy to another failure of the international order. Mr. Costello, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Marjorie, and thank you to the People's Academy of International Law and all of our panelists for adding to our knowledge on these important topics. I'll go ahead and start my presentation here. Okay, great. So yes, Iran is very much in the news today, as I'm sure everyone in attendance is aware. And unfortunately, we have gone from, an actual successful model of international diplomacy to yet another failure and illegal wars against Iran. So, starting relatively, recently, we had the Iran nuclear negotiations play out between 2013 and 2015, essentially setting up the joint comprehensive plan of action, which took a lot of laborious negotiations, a lot of coordination between the permanent members of the UN Security Council to craft a really comprehensive deal that achieved the bottom lines of all the parties. The U.S. assured itself that Iran would not get a nuclear weapon. Iran assured itself that it would get sanctions relief and not get attacked. But President Trump ended up destroying this carefully crafted agreement back in 2018, and then imposing new sanctions in violation of the UN Security Council resolution endorsing the agreement. And over time, really renormalizing the unilateral and extra-legal isolation and punishment of Iran. And so the end result has really, in many ways, been the antithesis of international law, an illegal war launched without congressional or United Nations authorization by two nuclear armed powers against a non-nuclear state, complete with war crimes like the bombing of an elementary school in Minab, killing 156 people, mostly young children, and the destruction of a great deal of Iran's civilian infrastructure that many ordinary civilians depend on, not military targets. So Iran has long been perceived in Washington as something of a pariah state. It's an isolated, theocratic, authoritarian government. And U.S. intelligence believes that at one point it had an active nuclear weapons program. This is kind of a point of contention, but essentially the 2007 national intelligence estimate put out by the U.S. intelligence community indicated, and to the consternation of neoconservatives and the George W. Bush administration, that Iran had discontinued organized work to weaponize its nuclear program in 2003, the very same year the George W. Bush administration invaded neighboring Iraq and deposed Saddam Hussein, Iran's chief neighbor geopolitical rival, which was also believed to maybe have an active nuclear program itself. Since that time, Iran has pursued a hedging strategy, which means it's developing its nuclear program under the justification that it's for civilian purposes. And supporting their point, embedded in the Non-Proliferation Treaty that was discussed earlier under Article 4, are provisions supporting the right of non-nuclear states to use nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. Regardless, fears in Washington have persisted that the Iranian nuclear program could be used to weaponize in short order, and thus Iran could join the ranks of nuclear powers unless they were convinced not to by various means. So many in Washington have long encouraged that the U.S. and various presidents should bomb Iran and re-bomb Iran to end the threat that Iran could eventually proliferate. Now, back before the Obama era negotiations really kicked off and so forth, President Obama rejected that advice, put forward by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and others, and embarked on a different approach. At first, he escalated far-reaching sanctions against Iran in his first term, but then he pivoted to negotiations in his second term. This was facilitated by members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany, known as the P5+1. Again, the negotiations were laborious. It took time, but they really kicked off following the election of the moderate Hassan Rouhani as president of Iran. And they played out over the course of 2013 through 2015. You first had an interim nuclear deal, then a transition deal laying out the contours of the agreement, then a comprehensive deal that went into effect in January 2016. There were a lot of politics at play in Washington, a lot of Republican opposition to the agreement, a lot of lobbying with millions of dollars to kind of tarnish the reputation of this deal. But ultimately, it failed to block the agreement from going into force. And it was a significant diplomatic achievement that placed the United Nations and international law at the center. UN Security Council Resolution 2231 replaced earlier UN resolutions against Iran, calling on them to comply, to halt enrichment, to do a number of things, and then obligated the new UN Security Council resolution obligated the parties to the deal to abide by its terms. So significant benefits followed. Iran's nuclear program shrunk. It was highly monitored, provided assurance that it couldn't be weaponized. Iran retained its perceived nuclear rights, benefited from sanctions lifting, and pressures were eased on the Iranian economy. Inflation fell to the single digits for the first time in years. The GDP grew, unemployment shrank, and so forth. But, core disputes really through this process had been resolved between the U.S. and Iran without a single shot being fired. War was averted, as was the risk of a nuclear Iran. So really triumph of multilateralism, but unfortunately it was all undone. So President Trump comes into office, and over the first 16 months or so, he actually abides by the agreement. He was actually among the less hawkish Republican candidates for president way back in 2016, whereas you had people like Ted Cruz saying, he'll kill the deal on day one. Trump took a slightly different tack. He said he'd enforce the contract to the fullest and so forth. And a lot of his advisors, when he first came in, really kept him in the agreement. They saw the benefits of the deal and, didn't want to embark on the path of further escalation, potential military conflict against Iran. But that all changed. President Trump decided to abrogate the deal. I think he, did not like the fact that a political rival in Barack Obama had struck it. And it was seen as this great diplomatic achievement, and he thought he could do better, get a better deal by pressuring Iran, and reimposing sanctions and so forth. All of the snapback of sanctions, the abrogation of the deal, there was no Iranian violation. This was all, in direct violation of the provisions of UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which had endorsed the accord and called on member states to uphold it. Iran actually abides by the deal for a whole year, even though the U.S. had reneged on everything that it had promised to do on sanctions lifting, until the Trump administration pursues something called maximum pressure. So not just the reimposition of sanctions, but trying to do extraterritorial sanctions to drive Iran's oil sales to zero, and then taking another extra step of designating the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, one of the main military apparatuses within the Iranian state, as a terrorist organization. This is the first instance where the U.S. had designated a foreign military group as a foreign terrorist organization. So it's somewhere where you could literally be drafted into a foreign terrorist organization. These measures pushed Iran out of compliance with the JCPOA, which had continued, over the course of a year. Sanctions were a form of very harsh collective punishment, which itself is a violation of international law. Inflation spiked from single digits up to around 40%, where it's hung around for years. Millions of Iranians fell out of the middle class and swelled the ranks of the impoverished. Iranian civilians have had to make a lot of sacrifices, including a number of people cutting out meat from their diet, a lot of staple foods and so forth that became harder and harder to afford. Trump himself, avoided falling into a war. He walked right up to the edge, both in 2019 and 2020. But ultimately, President Biden was elected and on a campaign promise to restore the JCPOA. He ultimately failed to do so. He didn't follow through on that commitment. There were essentially two camps within the Biden administration, one of which supported returning to the deal, struck under the last Democratic president. And the other camp, which essentially was the winning camp, which wanted to use leverage created by Trump's sanctions, perceived leverage created by Trump's sanctions, to convince Iran to strike a better deal under U.S. interests and so forth. But essentially, time was squandered. They didn't do it, and things got more and more complicated as time went on. So maximum pressure essentially was allowed to stay in place under the Biden administration. So we get back to a situation where Trump comes back into office, and he had, seemingly as a campaign strategy, adopted a lot of rhetoric about being a president of peace, of not getting the United States into more forever wars. It's a little bit hard to know whether he believed this at all, but pretty much almost immediately, Negotiations kick off. There are about a couple of months of Trump-Iran negotiations brokered by Oman, but then the U.S. and Israel essentially attack Iran in June of 2025, and then again in February of this year. In both instances, there are active negotiations underway to try to resolve the conflict. It does appear Iran was willing to make a deal, not a surrender deal, but a deal that would essentially roll back Iran's nuclear program again, subject it to inspections. But essentially, those came to naught, those negotiations with these surprise attacks against Iran. These were wars that were launched without the United Nations, without Security Council approval, and then also without congressional approval. So illegal both under U.S. And international law. So both the June Israeli-U.S. war against Iran and the 2026 phase of the war done in violation of the UN Charter, which prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of other states. And it's also, a real sharp break from even past administrations. The George W. Bush administration in attacking Iraq, it actually went to the United Nations and sought UN approval. It didn't get it, but it did make a pitch before launching its own illegal war. And there's been no approval from Congress, no debate, no nothing. It's just Trump unilaterally going out here and attacking another country. And as Marjorie mentioned at the very beginning of these presentations, this was an attack of two nuclear-armed states against a non-nuclear state that had arguably been abiding or somewhat adhering to its non-proliferation treaty commitments not to pursue a nuclear weapon. And that really could shake the continued viability of the integrity of the non-proliferation regime. You have a lot of instances of nuclear weapon states who had signed up to that treaty not taking steps to disarm and then actively working with a country outside of the NPT that had developed nuclear weapons, as we heard, to attack a non-nuclear weapon state. So I do think there are key questions that need to be answered here regarding, the path forward and how to address this. But it's a consequence of illegality, of failing to adhere to international norms, of failing to do, what's kind of the core bargain here, under international law, under the United Nations, under the NPT. It's really worth emphasizing just how much civilians have paid the biggest price. Trump officials have bragged about throwing out rules of engagement and bragging that this is not a politically correct war. What they mean is they're bragging that they're not following international law, provisions that are designed to protect and minimize civilian harm. So, Geneva Convention states it is prohibited to attack, destroy, remove, or render useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population for the specific purpose of denying them their sustenance, value to the civilian population or to the adverse party. Likewise, civilian infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, are supposed to be protected, with warring parties obligated to make efforts to limit harm to the civilian population. Unfortunately, we've seen these principles be wholesale violated in Iran, including strikes on civilians and civilian objects, such as residential buildings, oil and gas infrastructure. We saw an oil depot bombed in a city of 9 million, spreading toxic smoke. Acid rain could have long-term health impacts. We've seen hundreds of schools destroyed, hospitals and medical facilities, desalination plants, power plants, bridges, all of these things that are supporting a civilian population, a population of 92 million. But they've been heavily impacted over the course of the recent 40 days of war. Tens of thousands of civilian sites have been damaged and destroyed, including through the dropping of heavy munitions, including 2,000-pound bombs in densely populated civilian areas. And then at the outset of the war, the very first day of the war, we had, one of the biggest tragedies also unfold where a school, the Shajareh Tayyibeh school in Minab in Iran on the coast of the Persian Gulf was targeted and destroyed, claiming the lives of 156 people, 120 of those being students between the ages of 7 and 12. 73 boys and 47 girls, which is the largest civilian death toll of any single U.S. attack since 1991. And this is, a situation where the U.S. planning its attack had a list that it drew up. We don't know all of the details and so forth yet. The investigation that the Pentagon is supposedly undertaking has not reached a conclusion, but it appears to have been a U.S. Tomahawk missile or two that struck the school and killed all of these children. Over the course of the war writ large, the impact is much bigger, but at least 1,700 civilians killed, including 244 children. And just a horrific loss of life, both in Minab and across Iran and the region. Marjorie also touched on this threat of civilizational destruction that President Trump put out a couple of weeks ago, saying a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again. Has also threatened repeatedly to bomb every power plant and bridge inside of Iran. The genocidal threat, it's one of the most grievous crimes. The U.S. is a signatory of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And so if he were to ever act on this threat, including if the very tentative ceasefire were to break down, the U.S. would be potentially a party to a horrific crime, which it has said it would not ever commit. So, again, to sum up, we've had nothing gained from this illegal war. No U.S. goals have been fundamentally achieved. The civilians have paid a disastrous outcome. So we've ultimately had the U.S. try this illegal, disastrous war, and really it's had no effect to enhance U.S. security. Quite the opposite. It's had a horrific impact on the U.S. economy, and it's dealt a grievous blow to the international order, both the non-proliferation regime and the effort to restrict unlawful warfare. This is real tragedy because we actually had a deal in place to resolve some of the security concerns emanating from Iran, done through multilateral institutions, the United Nations, in coordination with a number of different parties, the U.S., European countries, Russia, China, Germany, all to come together and use the levers of these multilateral institutions to bring Iran to the table and craft an agreement, to prevent this war ultimately from taking place. So the answer is not to double down on further violations of international law, but to pursue a policy grounded in international law, return to negotiations, good faith negotiations, not simply bombastic threats backed up by the threat of wiping out power plants, wiping out bridges. And, JCPOA negotiations, while derided by President Trump, continue to serve as a model that if we work kind of together across nations, perhaps we can get to a better place than we are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Costello, for explaining the laborious process that led to the Comprehensive Iran Nuclear Deal, or the JCPOA, which was working to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons until Trump destroyed the deal and Biden followed Trump's inhumane policy. And also thanks for detailing the illegality of the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran. It violates both international human rights law because it's an illegal use of force under the UN Charter, and international humanitarian law under the Geneva Conventions and the laws of war because of the targeting of civilians. So thank you so much for that. We will now move to the next phase of our program, and that is a discussion among the faculty members or additions or questions that they might have about each other's presentations. So the floor is now open to our esteemed faculty. If you'd like to comment on each other's presentations. I do want to say one thing, and that is that Ryan Costello mentioned the sanctions that the U.S. imposed against Iran. Those are illegal sanctions, just like the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela are illegal sanctions, as are the sanctions and the inhumane blockade against Cuba by the United States. They're called unilateral coercive measures. And under the UN Charter, only the Security Council has the power and the authority to impose sanctions. When one country, like the United States, imposes sanctions, they are called unilateral coercive measures, and they're illegal. So when you hear about how the U.S. is blowing up boats near Venezuela to enforce the sanctions, those are illegal sanctions to begin with, as are the U.S. sanctions on Iran that are punishing those people as we speak.
If I may start with a question to Mr. Costello, I was wondering, does Trump actually risk impeachment for not having approval by the US for this war? I'm not American myself, so I'm actually ignorant about this.
It's a good question. Let's see. I would say not under the current Congress, where essentially Republicans have a majority, and they have been in lockstep on most things when it comes to Trump, particularly in the second term thus far. So we've actually had some articles of impeachment and calls for the 25th Amendment, which is a process where Trump's cabinet could theoretically remove him by finding him unfit for office. That emerged after the genocidal threat against Iran. But this was kind of a very short window. Trump did that threat and then pivoted to a ceasefire and so forth. And I think a lot of people wrote it off as just rhetoric, bombast from Trump and so forth, not something he actually intended to act upon and so forth. So I do think it is something that could be acted upon in a different Congress if Democrats gain both control of the House and the Senate. I don't know exactly what they would choose, but there would probably be an effort to impeach Trump. And, there were a few efforts in his first term as well that were detailed, one on Ukraine, one on January 6th toward the end of his term and so forth, but also didn't achieve the numbers needed to remove him from office. So I don't think it's been a serious tool right now. It could become one later. But unfortunately, there's essentially been a pass for presidents from either party to wage war illegally, both under U.S. and international law. So, there could have been efforts similarly against President Obama over Libya, Trump over Iran, a handful of other countries as well. But none of those have essentially happened, and there's kind of a bipartisan pass for these things.
If I might add one thing to what you just said, Mr. Costello, and that is that, and I think you did touch on this, but Trump was impeached twice during his first term. Impeachment means bringing charges. So the House of Representatives brought charges against Trump 2 times. Then, under the Constitution, it moves to the Senate, and they have to vote by a 2/3 majority to find him guilty and remove him from office, and they fell short of that. The 25th Amendment, in order to remove him from office, would require agreement of his cabinet and his vice president. And they walk in lockstep with him. They're not about to do that. Do have a thing called the War Powers Resolution, which was passed after the Vietnam War because Congress wanted to enforce its constitutional authority to declare war and not hand that over to the president. And there have been resolutions that have been introduced in Congress recently to try to stop Trump from basically prosecuting his illegal war in Iran, but because of the political makeup of Congress, they have failed.
Yeah, the war powers resolutions have come somewhat close to at least passing. The most recent House resolution voted a couple of weeks ago here failed by one vote, with one Democrat breaking, who would have been the difference maker. And then the Senate, there's going to be another vote today, kind of locked at 47 in favor of a war powers resolution directing the U.S. Out of hostilities with Iran, but 53 opposed. So right now it's kind of in stasis at the moment.
Could that in stasis moment change in November with the midterm election? Is that?
Yeah, I think if Trump goes fully back to war, right now we're in a situation where most of the bombing and so forth has ceased, but there's an effort to impose a blockade on Iran, which is itself an act of war. And Iran is taking some measures as well to target shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. But I think if there's a kind of breakdown of the quasi ceasefire that's in place, you could see numbers shift and a majority in either the House or the Senate supportive of war powers resolutions to just get out. It would require Republicans breaking with Trump, which they haven't been able to do outside of a one or two, essentially, in the House and Senate who are supportive of the war powers resolutions.
Thank you for that.
We have a question here from one of our students. Could the speakers address the so-called North Korean model, as North Korea relatively recently shifted its constitution to include its self-definition and its foundational commitment to continuing to be a nuclear state, and it has repeatedly referenced Libya as a negative example of what happens when a small country that has repeatedly been targeted by the U.S. war machine gives up its nukes. Now, Iran is another example of the acute vulnerabilities of a non-nuclear state. In mid-century, the United States waged a war of aggression in which it ruled the skies over Korea, killing between 20 and 30% of the North Korean population. So do the faculty members believe that there are any viable alternatives to the North Korean model in this historic junction? And if so, what are they?
So
Yes.
I'm happy to begin. I think the fundamental problem that we've had is that what we've attempted to do is separate non-proliferation from disarmament and pretend like these are two separate tracks towards a better, safer world. And the problem is that they're deeply intertwined. If the logic for claiming that you're not disarming is going to be that you need nuclear weapons for your own security, then of course some states are going to conclude from that they need nuclear weapons for their own security. So you quite simply cannot dissociate one from the other. We have to have non-proliferation go in concert with disarmament. And again, we've made progress since 1986 till about 10, 15 years ago, and now it's all stalled. And now we see the non-proliferation pressures become even greater. What is so obvious, if you really think about it, is that if we continue to sort of live in this kind of lawless world where international law is simply disregarded at all turns, there will be more states that acquire nuclear weapons. And then we will be in that situation that John F. Kennedy worried about in the early 60s of 15 or 20 or 25 nuclear weapon states. And then our, demise is essentially assured. So yes, that those conclusions that North Korea drew from what had happened with regime change operations that, in particular, the United States had engaged in, really not just in the 21st century. I mean, that history is far longer. But those very acute recent examples do point to one conclusion, but it's quite simply not a conclusion that is going to, assure even the basic survival of humanity. This is really the key. The key issue is we have global existential threats, and then we have nations acting within their own national interests, and we somehow have to merge those and find a way to really negotiate towards the kind of disarmament. From my perspective, the ideal world would be a world free of nuclear weapons, but even a world in which we have far fewer nuclear weapons than we have today would be a much better world than where we are today.
Thank you for that. We have another question. Besides the prohibition on the use of force, the UN Charter establishes a positive obligation to resort to peaceful mechanisms of dispute settlements. Would the faculty members agree that from these provisions derive an obligation of non-escalation, and that nuclear deterrence would be incompatible with this negative obligation? No disagreement there. And then the second part is to which extent the problem of double standard without a jus cogens prohibition. Jus cogens means the highest prohibition in international law, no exceptions, no statute of limitations, no immunity. Without a jus cogens prohibition of nuclear weapons, can erode all efforts made to the date. Is it terribly counterproductive that nuclear states are the most outspoken against nuclear proliferation? Can this situation lead to states systematically withdrawing from treaties?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we're all afraid to say it, right? But that could be how this unfolds. This NPT 11th review conference will begin on Monday, will go on for 4 weeks. The treaty is under a lot of pressure, obviously, from what's happening currently right here, right now, but also the last 2 review conferences in 2015, and then the following one was supposed to be in 2020, but because of COVID, it was moved to 22. Both of those ended without a consensus document. That means the states parties could not agree on even a simple, let alone an elaborate document that charts the path for the treaty going forward. So the treaty was already, one could say, in a sort of weak state. And of course, recent events, even just the last few weeks, have really called into question a lot of what this all means, even as has been put today. What does it mean for a nuclear weapon state recognized by the treaty, the United States, to work with another nuclear armed state that is not recognized by the treaty, that is not part of the treaty, to attack A third one that has been a part of Iran is one of the original signatories of the NPT. Iran led efforts in 1974, the beginning of efforts to establish a Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction, along with Egypt. Iran was subject to more IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, Atomic Energy Agency inspections per nuclear power plant than any other country, in the world. I mean, this is a really significant and difficult moment. I think as we've been saying, for international law in general, but really for the NPT regime in particular.
And I just wanted to add very quickly that I thought it was very interesting in Mrs. Huge's presentation that you could see that basically the same countries already systematically withdrew or not signed some on non-proliferation. There was China, there was France, there was North Korea. And maybe they signed one and not the other, but basically it was kind of always the same countries that pumped it up. One could argue it already happened, so I guess nothing new under the sun.
We have time for one final question. Given that Iran has no reason to believe any deal it agrees to will be honored long-term by the U.S., how stable will any future deal be?
I can try to address that one. I think the answer is not very stable, unfortunately. And, we even have a situation here where because Iran has been attacked midstream of the last two diplomatic cycles, there was extra hesitancy to even convene in Islamabad this week to have a second round of negotiations with the U.S. when the U.S. couldn't even really stick to the terms of the original ceasefire, both on its extension to Lebanon and then in imposing kind of a second blockade to try to create new conditions to extract new concessions from Iran and so forth. So, both the attacks of the United States and then the prior abrogation of the JCPOA, the snapback of illegal sanctions on Iran, all of these feed into already pre-existing doubts that Iran could ever trust the United States and so forth. So it's very, very difficult. And then, I do think it's possible Trump, if he actually shifts gears and does try to engage, could get a deal that has some terms that are better than what was in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. I think that is a possibility. However, you have to look at the political environment as well. And Iran, might not be as incentivized. I would say probably would not be as incentivized to actually abide by that agreement as they did the JCPOA for a pretty significant period of time.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to our esteemed faculty, our administrator, the interpreters, as well as the People's Academy Task Force. The next program of the People's Academy of International Law will be the role of women in the fight for peace and achieving feminist justice. It will be scheduled for Wednesday, May the 20th, and it will be dedicated to the late Evelyn Dermeyer, a beloved trailblazer for the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, at the UN Commission on the Status of Women, and editor of the International Review of Contemporary Law. You will receive more information soon. See you then. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.